So we're going to jump back into Richard Morgan Casey's testimony to the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry, and it appears that Richard Morgan is caught out by the court transcripts because he has maintained at this point that basically the documents that were signed off by Lee Castleton were signed off as true and accurate. Therefore, it reversed the burden of proof. It showed that he'd taken the money, even though they couldn't necessarily prove the loss. But the court transcript of the opening is read out where Lee Castleton is questioning the figures and tells the judge that he was repeatedly calling the helpline and received assurances that everything was okay and they'd be investigating the losses because he didn't agree that the losses were real and that they were an artefact of the computer system. And then further evidence is shown whilst he's being cross-examined by Richard Morgan Casey that he's questioning the accuracy of the figures and highlighting that he was repeatedly calling the helpline, informing them of the discrepancies every time the accounts were happening, and was explaining how the accounts were being generated and why he thought they weren't correct. And Richard Morgan seems to be struggling for an answer to this now, having previously testified that Lee Castleton hadn't raised any issues with the figures. Let's jump into the inquiry.
Just on that point,
yes.
I'll come back to the note in a moment. Can we look, please, at LCAS 40197, a transcription of the recording of the opening again?
Yes.
Can we just go to page 11, please, and look at the foot of the page? Thank you. You're, in this part of the opening, Mr. Morgan, taking the judge through some weekend balances and doing it week by week, referring to accounting periods, and you've dealt with 52. And the judge asks, second box from the bottom, I see. I don't quite know what a trial balance is. Do I need to know that? You say, well, my lord, if I may, I'll bring your lordship back to the delights of the Post Office accounting system, as I hope I make my opening more coherent. I'm afraid it's quite a technical trial in looking at how these figures are made up. And not that your lordship needs any reinforcement, but it's taken me some number of weeks to work out how all the figures go backwards and forwards. But I hope I'll be able to give your lordship a rational and relatively simple explanation. Of course, Mr. Castleton is the expert and will be hearing from in due course. Mr. Castleton, could I, my lord? The judge says yes. Mr. Castleton, my lord, sorry, throughout this period, the actual trial balance, I'll be the final balance for this week, is actually produced on a Wednesday evening. And at this point is when the sub-postmaster is allowed to address any issues throughout the week's trading. If there are any shortfalls, then he's able to ring a helpline that's run by the post office in order to explain any problems that he's had over the former week, any balancing problems that have occurred prior to the Thursday morning. And you'll see that all those cash accounts are actually timed and dated on the following morning, which is a Thursday. I see, because you'll find that all of those losses have had phone calls and assurances from the post office themselves that they would look into the reason as to why those losses were occurring. Yes.
So essentially, every time he's submitted these accounts, which Richard Morgan's basing his whole case on, he's immediately rang up the helpline to say there's something wrong with these accounts, and the post office have assured him they're going to look into it, not hang him out to dry.
So they were all reported, yes, and then it stops. That appears to be Mr. Castleton in the course of the opening, saying that although the weekends were the weekend accounts
Yes.
were signed off, all of the losses had phone calls made to the helpline with assurances from the post office that they would look into the reason why the losses were occurring. And then in evidence, poll 306-9279.
So we've obviously got to bear in mind at this point that throughout this, Richard Morgan has attested to the fact that actually that Lee Castleton didn't raise any issues in the trial about the accuracy of the accounts. Well, we can see there, it seems he addressed it in the opening.
This is a transcript of Mr. Castleton's evidence. And can we look at page 37, please, and look at E. This is you cross-examining Mr. Castleton still. You asked, do you also accept that when you produced the document at 2979, that was a draft report produced so as to enable you to check the figures before you put them into the final cash account? No, because inaudible final cash account. I'm sorry, but that's not the case. The cash account generates itself It's generated from the transaction something, Chesterfield. If you take up that bundle 6B, you say, and he replies, yes. You say, I suggest that in fact the cash account is generated by your machine at Marine Drive branch. It's not generated by Chesterfield. Answer, if you look at blank witness statement, you'll find that the series of checks that the computer does through Marine Drive Post Office branch through Chesterfield corresponds. It's not generated in-house. And you'll also find me checking these figures now, that to check is not a generated or figure that we actually place into the computer. It is a check has been done daily on separate information that the computer then reproduces in the cash account. And scrolling down, again at E, you ask, did the cash accounts correspond to the physical evidence of the transactions you had undertaken? Answer, no, not always. We need to differentiate between cash account and the daily transaction on the logs, and also the stock figures produced by balance snapshots. And then over the page, please, at C. So you check all the figures in the final balance against fiscal records, yes, and only when you're happy with that do you proceed to print out cash account final. Answer, and if there's anything I don't agree with, I make a phone call to a helpline, which is what we repeatedly did. So thinking back, given the intervention in the opening and the evidence that was given there, wasn't it the case that Mr. Castleton was saying, yes, I signed the accounts that were produced for me by the Horizon system, not within my branch. I was signing that there was a discrepancy, a shortfall between the cash and the stock which the system said I should have, and the cash and stock which I in fact had, and I was reporting that at the time. It's not something that's only emerged years later, is it?
Well, my impression of his evidence, and that may be a false impression, and it's the impression that the judge formed, and it's the impression that one gets from reading the defence as well, is that the figures that were signed off by him were what was actually present.
Well, that's all fine and dandy, but you were at the trial, the judge was at the trial, you know, everyone in the courtroom was at the trial, and whatever impression you formed based on the evidence, maybe it wasn't worded as clearly as it could, whatever impression had been formed is clearly blown out the water by the actual direct interaction that you had whilst crossing Lee Castleton at the trial. So surely that changes the complexion on things.
And that were a fair and true reflection of what had occurred.
He was signing off that there was a discrepancy, that there was a shortfall.
Yes.
And contemporaneously reporting that it wasn't his responsibility. He was reporting that back to the post office, wasn't he? That's what he was saying.
But there was a discrepancy between what he'd got and what he ought to have.
Yes.
And that's what a loss is.
Even if it was generated by Horizon.
Well, that may be where we differ, because at the end of the day, what he actually has and the business that he's done, if there's a discrepancy between that and what he ought to have, then that's a shortfall.
But not necessarily representing an actual loss to the post office.
Even if one of those is produced by a computer, which he says is faulty.
Well, I'm sorry, hang on. I'm not quite sure what you say is the bit that's faulty.
A document that I'm signing which says I should have this amount of cash and stock, £1,000, I've in fact got £500 of cash and stock. I'll sign that to say the system says I should have £1,000, I've in fact got £500. Sign that, true and accurate. Get on the phone and say, the bit of the account which says I should have £1,000 is wrong. It's been created in the following ways. I mean, I'm not going to go through all of Mr. Castleton's calls to the helpline, where he repeatedly explained to them on the day that the event happened why the system was creating phantom figures.
And that must have been soul destroying, to have the stress and the worry of the system not working, constant reassurances from the post office, and feeling like every Wednesday night, Thursday morning is like Groundhog Day, going through the same thing again and again and seeming to get nowhere. And then to make matters worse, the final resolution being you're suspended, we're taking a case against you, we're now going to dismiss you, we're going to take all this money off you, and now you have to pay costs for this case, all down to, things where we've actually not looked into it properly, and despite our assurances to you when you rang the helpline.
But that was his case, wasn't it? It wasn't only something that emerged years later before Mr. Justice Fraser. And it may be that it wasn't very well articulated by Mr. Castleton, being a litigant in person. But showing you the two things that I have, the opening and the evidence and the point were there, weren't they?
I didn't understand them to be there in that way at the time. Nor did I understand them to be there on the basis of paragraph 3 of the amended defence and counterclaim at LCAS 000294.
That's all very well. Jason Beer KC has just said that it might not have been represented or articulated as clearly as possible. Nevertheless, following on from the defence is the trial, which we are reading the transcript of, and it was surely made very clear there, as it's being pointed out now, that that was indeed the defence to the allegations.
4400294.